Honorable, the Chief Justice and the Associate Justices of the Supreme Court of the United States. Oh, yay, oh, yay. The court is now sitting.
We'll hear argument first, McGirt versus Oklahoma.
In a major victory for indigenous sovereignty, the Supreme Court ruled Thursday that about half of Oklahoma remains Native American land.
It was a momentous decision granting jurisdictional control for criminal justice cases to the Muscogee Creek Nation and 4 neighboring tribal nations.
Justice Sotomayor?
That nation was wrenched from its homeland, marched to Oklahoma, and then given a treaty which guaranteed its sovereignty.
In 2020, in a case known as McGirt versus Oklahoma, the Supreme Court ruled that the eastern half of Oklahoma belongs to 5 Indian reservations.
The case is submitted.
The ruling took the authority to prosecute tribal citizens away from the state, and in most cases gave it back to the tribes themselves. For the nationwide movement for tribal sovereignty, this was a stunning victory. It rolled back nearly 2 centuries of betrayal, of policies that robbed the natives of their lands, their culture, and their right to self-governance.
I think that part of any discussion about McGirt has to be about justice. When I read those words at the end of the Trail of Tears, there was a promise to live through a time where a promise that was broken by the United States would then be kept. That's extraordinary.
For people like Francis Danger, a writer and citizen of the Muscogee Nation, McGirt was an opportunity to at least partially redeem that painful history. How did you feel the day the McGirt decision came down?
I cried. I cried. I was shocked. You know, there are over 500 treaties that this government made with Native nations, and every single one of them have been broken. And to finally have one of those promises recognized and affirmed, amazing. Amazing. And just the sheer implications of what that could mean. I was like, we've never had this before.
The promises that the McGirt ruling upheld were made by the U.S. in treaties signed with the 5 nations when they were forced off their homelands in the Trail of Tears. Those treaties said the tribe's new reservations in what was then known simply as Indian Territory would be theirs to live on and govern forever. But that's not what happened. How is it that these treaties were broken in the first place?
27 lines down from all men are created equal in the Declaration of Independence. We are called merciless Indian savages. The reason we were called savages is because we held our land collectively. And that was seen as backwards thinking. In order to be civilized, you needed to have ownership.
So the U.S. divided up the reservations into individually owned plots, and non-Indians bought the land up until very little was left. That strategy was used across the West to open up Indian lands to white settlers. And now, after generations of settlement, what's at stake is not just the land, but the resources on it. Nowhere is that more evident than Oklahoma, which is and has always been oil country. Though it remains unclear, the McGirt ruling could mean that the tribes will be in charge of taxing and regulating the oil industry. That has a lot of people worried.
Just for this well, the oil gets pumped out of there.
Right.
And then
it goes into this area. This is called a tank battery. That's where the oil and water are separated and then accumulate in these tanks.
Dewey Bartlett Jr. comes from a prominent political family that moved to Oklahoma to prospect for oil over 100 years ago. His family's small oil company has about 75 wells on what McGirt reaffirmed as reservation land.
When the tribes say things like, this is our land and you're trespassing, what do you think?
I've got a deed to my house, and it's in the Muscogee Creek Nation. I'll sell it to you at my price if you want it that bad. Or this property, same thing. I have 100 years of legal transactions that have occurred that have said that at the end of the day, this is mine.
Do you think it's fair to say that after McGirt, the oil and gas industry is afraid of losing the influence it has over the state government?
Yes, because now we have a very good relationship with state government. And if that were to go away, then who do we deal with? And I think if we had to deal with a tribe, whatever the rules are, we would live and abide by the rules. Now, they might drive us out of business.
Do you actually worry that the tribes might drive you out of business if they wind up being in charge of the industry?
Sure. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Bartlett's operation is a tiny fraction of what's at stake. More than 40% of Oklahoma's oil and gas production is on the original reservations. And it isn't just oil. If the tribes gain authority over not just criminal matters, but also civil matters like taxation, there are millions in tax revenue that would go to the tribes and not the state. The government of Oklahoma is going to extreme lengths to prevent this.
Oklahoma has been robbed of the authority to prosecute crimes.
Governor Kevin Stitt has gone on a PR blitz, painting McGirt as a catastrophe that's led to criminal mayhem.
We have people on death row that are doing 23andMe DNA tests trying to get their convictions overturned.
But out of thousands of affected cases, McGirt has led to the release of just 33 people. And although some tribes have gone from handling a few dozen to a few thousand cases a year, their leaders say they have things under control.
Governor Kevin Stitt is the most anti-Indian governor in the history of the state of Oklahoma. But the Cherokee Nation has put over $30 million into building up our criminal justice system. We've taken on over 4,000 felony cases. We can work together. I just wish the governor of the state of Oklahoma would join us in that effort.
Along with the PR campaign, Oklahoma has gone on a legal offensive to undermine McGirt, filing dozens of petitions to the Supreme Court, sometimes with the help of the oil industry.
The case that's currently before the Supreme Court is narrowly focused on this technical question of criminal jurisdiction. But there is a lot more on the line, and you can tell based on the groups that are getting involved in the litigation. This is an amicus brief filed by, among others, the Petroleum Alliance of Oklahoma. It's a business group that represents the largest oil and gas producers in the state. This is the same sector that has spent heavily getting Kevin Stitt elected as governor of Oklahoma, and it's Stitt and his attorney general that are now devoting tons of resources to arguing this case before the Supreme Court against the tribes.
It's now my distinct privilege to introduce the governor of the great state of Oklahoma, Kevin Stitt.
Well, thank you so much. First, we want to thank the Supreme Court for agreeing to hear this case. Some of the most violent crimes, they're just going unprosecuted in eastern Oklahoma. As the governor, my job is to protect law and order and enforce justice for Native victims and all 4 million Oklahomans.
Do you see a connection between the McGirt decision and the functioning of oil and gas in Oklahoma?
If it's expanded to be a reservation for all purposes, and that's not the position of the state, that's not the position of the court behind us, it was just for the Major Crimes Act, but sure, this could erode oil and gas. And so those are things that it'll either be endless litigation or we'll get some clarity around this.
For many tribal citizens, it's not just about money and taxes. It's about moving beyond a worldview that sees the land purely as something to be exploited.
The Muscogee Nation's Director of Environmental Services is going to take me to see the site of an oil spill that's been sitting here for 2 years without getting properly cleaned up. This is an oil supply line that we're following to the site of the spill.
I can smell it.
Yeah, you can smell it.
Smell petroleum. That's strong, isn't it?
That's just oil, right? That's
just
all
oil. Yeah. There is a supply line carrying the petroleum product. Looked like it sprung a leak, then it comes down through here, migrated down this way, and then hits the creek there. It's definitely a major breach and a leak.
Why is it that this has been allowed to sit here like this for so long?
Oil and gas is big here in Oklahoma. I mean, they've been driving the boat since the turn of the century. When we talk about sovereignty on our reservation, we're talking about being in control of all of our natural resources. We're talking about being able to even have issues like this, being able to come in and say, you need to clean that up. It was always a reservation, you know, and it just took the Supreme Court to verify that. It feels like we have an opportunity here. Also, I think we have an obligation that we need to take care of what we've got in the reservation. Well, we know it's a challenge. We welcome that challenge.
The Five Nations are now poised to have more political power than they've had in generations. And tribes around the country are paying close attention to whether they actually get it. Ryan Leonard is Governor Stitt's point person on tribal affairs. He's been tasked with making sure the consequences of the McGirt ruling stay as limited as possible. What will happen if the McGirt decision winds up extending to civil matters, not just criminal matters?
If that's the case, I think you could make the very valid case that the state of Oklahoma no longer exists in the form that it has for 114 years leading up to McGirt. The bottom line is that for well over 100 years, generations of Oklahoma leaders, tribal and non-tribal, all believed that the reservations were disestablished at statehood. And frankly, I think that if you really look into it, that is the basis, in large part, for the tribe's great success in Oklahoma.
I think a lot of tribal citizens would say Oklahoma didn't develop as this sort of harmonious union between tribal and non-tribal citizens, as you've said. Rather, the Indian nations were forcibly dispossessed of their land and culture and forced to live under the jurisdiction, the illegitimate jurisdiction of the state of Oklahoma.
The story that you just recounted where the tribes were dispossessed is a tragic one, and that occurred all over the country.
It's the story of the United States, unquestionably.
It's the story of the United States. Oklahoma is no different. The entirety of the North American continent was Indian country. So where do you draw the line? Do we give downtown Chicago back to the Potawatomis? Do we return midtown Manhattan back to the tribes that were located there before the European settlers came? The path forward is one in which everybody's working to rise all boats.
When someone who works for the state asks a question like, well, where do we stop? Should we return Chicago to the native tribes that lived there before? Should we return New York City to the tribes that occupied that land before we arrived?
I think whenever someone puts it in those terms, they're not understanding that when we talk about land back, yes, we would like our land back, but we're not kicking anybody off. What we would like is control over it so we can undo what all these years of colonialism has done to it. And just because you're used to it doesn't make it right.
Is it fair to say that part of this is, if sovereignty is genuinely fully returned and exercised, yes, there will be some chaos. Is that a reason not to do it?
There's no reason not to do it, other than the fact that it calls into question everything this country was built on. I mean, think about it. American exceptionalism is about manifest destiny. We have the divine right to this land. We have the divine right to take it in any way that we want. By recognizing our sovereignty, it calls into question everything that everyone has ever believed anytime they looked at that flag and put their hand over their heart. And nobody wants to be the villain in the story. That's why they wrote history the way they did.